Chloe Barton had never been particularly interested in neighborhood politics or the subtle hierarchies that came with life in tightly planned residential communities. In fact, when she first purchased her modest two-story home at the edge of Silver Birch Lane, her only concern had been the proximity to her studio supplier and the old-growth trees she saw lining the rear fence line. She was a furniture restorer by trade, meticulous, self-reliant, and quiet by nature. After spending over a decade renting a cramped apartment above a bakery in the city where trucks rattled the walls at 6 a.m., and the scent of burnt croissants seemed permanently embedded in the wallpaper, she had finally found what she believed would be a retreat. A place where no one would knock unless invited, where the wind moving through leaves would be the loudest sound at night, and where she could sand down chair legs or varnish tabletops in peace. The house itself was nothing extravagant. Built sometime in the late 1970s, it had good bones and bad windows, solid floors, and a roof that didn't leak despite some worrying sag in one corner. To Chloe, that was all it needed to be. Her offer had gone through quickly, and after a brief delay caused by a misfiled inspection report, she closed and moved in with little fanfare. She didn't throw a housewarming party. She didn't send flyers to her neighbors introducing herself. She simply arrived one morning with a moving van, unloaded her workbench, her cats, her tools, and her favorite coffee grinder, and got to work making the house feel like her own. Silver Birch Lane was the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on being clean, cooperative, and harmonized, as one of the pamphlets described it. The lawns were mowed to matching lengths, shutters were all painted in subdued colonial tones, and garden gnomes, if permitted at all, had to be placed within 3 feet of the primary entryway and be non-distracting in color and demeanor. Chloe wasn't particularly interested in any of that. She kept to herself, trimmed her bushes, and planted herbs in weathered terracotta pots outside her kitchen window. She stacked firewood beside the back patio, installed a motion-sensitive light near her tool shed, and made a habit of sweeping the driveway every Sunday morning, not because she cared what the neighbors thought, but because she liked the ritual of it. Her first real interaction with anyone came 2 weeks after she moved in, when a woman knocked on her front door at precisely 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. Chloe had been in the middle of restoring an antique dresser and had paint-stained gloves on when she opened the door. The woman standing there introduced herself as Karen Miller. She was dressed in a pale pink windbreaker, beige slacks, and a white visor with the words Silver Birch Community embroidered in sky blue across the front. She held a clipboard, though she didn't look at it once during the exchange. Karen's tone was polite but clipped, like a flight attendant pointing out the exits while secretly daring you to challenge her authority. She welcomed Chloe to the neighborhood, complimented the choice of house, and then, without transition, commented that the shade of blue Chloe had painted her front door was not technically within the community's visual harmony palette, though she was sure it was an honest mistake. Chloe had stared at her, unsure whether to apologize or slam the door. Instead, she calmly asked what the official colors were, to which Karen responded by pulling a folded pamphlet from her clipboard and handing it over like a warning ticket. Chloe took it without a word, closed the door, and dropped the pamphlet in the recycling bin. From that moment on, Karen seemed to make herself a fixture on Chloe's periphery. She walked past the house at least twice a day, sometimes pausing just long enough to glance at Chloe's flower beds or her porch swing. Occasionally, Chloe would catch her peering through the slats of the side gate or walking her small white dog a little too slowly past the backyard fence. At first, it felt mildly annoying. Then it began to feel deliberate. But Chloe didn't confront her. She believed that distance was often the best response to intrusion, especially the passive-aggressive kind that came wrapped in fake smiles and tone-policed emails. But the distance didn't deter Karen. If anything, it seemed to embolden her. When Chloe installed a reclaimed iron light fixture above her garage, Karen appeared the next morning with a clipboard and a laminated rule sheet regarding approved exterior lighting. When Chloe placed a bird bath in her front yard, Karen returned the next day to mention that standing water could attract mosquitoes, and that the community had a shared interest in minimizing public health risks. Chloe, who had dealt with belligerent clients and stubborn paint layers, smiled tightly and said nothing. But she began locking her gate. She double-checked the doors at night. She started paying attention to the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk and how long the shadows lingered near her garage window at dusk. She was not paranoid. She was practical. And if the stories about overzealous neighborhood volunteers had taught her anything, it was that you didn't have to be breaking the rules to be targeted. You just had to live outside the comfort zone of someone who believed they were entitled to control more than their own square footage. Still, Chloe hadn't expected what happened next. It began with the trash. One Thursday morning, she walked outside to find her garbage bins upended in the street, their contents torn open and scattered. Not by animals. There were no claw marks, no bite holes, just methodical slashes through the bags, as if someone had been looking for something. She cleaned it up, chalked it up to a one-time incident, and moved on. Then it was her mail. 3 days of envelopes arrived soaking wet, even though there had been no rain. Her garden hose was mysteriously unspooled one morning and left running at a trickle. A bag of mulch she had purchased disappeared from her front steps. Her compost bin, once carefully sealed, had been flipped and left open to rot. Every incident was small, but together they formed a pattern, one that smelled of petty malice and intrusive obsession. And then came the violation slip. It was left not in the mailbox but tucked under her doormat, folded in thirds like a formal letter, printed in faint ink on generic paper. No signature, no official header, just a note stating that Chloe was in apparent violation of Regulation 12 concerning unapproved modifications to exterior property structure and that corrective action may be necessary pending further review. It was unsigned, undated, and unaddressed, but it referenced her specifically, and it had been placed with care. Chloe took the paper inside and laid it on her worktable, staring at it. She did not recognize the regulation, nor had she ever received a rulebook outlining any such clauses. When she contacted the main office that handled neighborhood records, they had no record of any official complaint or pending inspection. They advised her to keep a written log in case the issue escalated. When she asked them who exactly was authorized to issue violation notices, they responded vaguely, referencing committee participants and rotating members. No one gave her a straight answer. 3 days later, Chloe caught Karen standing just inside her front gate, holding a digital level tool, inspecting the angle of her rain gutters. That was the first time Chloe raised her voice. She had been coming home from the hardware store, arms full of supplies, when she saw Karen crouched near the side panel of her house. The gate, which Chloe always kept locked, stood ajar. Karen looked up, unfazed, and said, "You may have an improper incline here. Water drainage can cause rot, and that affects everyone. I thought it best to assess early." "You're on my property," Chloe said, her voice steady but cold. "Leave. Now." Karen didn't argue. She stood, brushed invisible dust from her knees, and left by the same gate she had somehow entered, closing it behind her with a calmness that felt theatrical. Chloe didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, she replaced the lock with a deadbolt, ordered a motion sensor camera, and began making a list not of violations but of incidents. She didn't know where it was going yet, but she had a feeling it wasn't over. In fact, she was certain of it. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of afternoon where nothing is expected to happen. The sky was an indifferent gray, the air warm but stale, and Chloe had just returned from a routine visit to the local hardware store with a replacement filter for her shop vacuum and a set of antique drawer pulls she'd found at a clearance bin near the register. She parked her truck in the driveway, not quite noticing the way the side gate was slightly ajar, and carried the box of supplies to her back door. When she unlocked it, stepped into the kitchen, and dropped the keys into the ceramic bowl on the counter, the house greeted her with its usual creaks and stillness. It wasn't until she set the box down in the garage and turned on the light that she noticed something was wrong. There was a faint sound, not a bang or crash, but the unmistakable hum of power tools echoing through the air like a subtle mosquito buzz buried deep in the walls. Chloe froze for a moment, confused by the noise. Her tools were locked. She hadn't scheduled any repairs. No one else had access to the house. She moved quickly but quietly toward the hallway, following the sound with careful, deliberate steps, her sneakers barely making a noise against the old wooden floor. As she rounded the corner and approached the utility room, the sound sharpened an electric drill, definitely. And then she saw her, Karen, standing near the circuit breaker panel, cordless drill in hand, her shoulder-length hair tucked into a visor, clipboard balanced on a plastic storage bin beside her. She wasn't startled. In fact, she looked up at Chloe with a kind of mild annoyance, as if the homeowner had interrupted an important job she had every right to perform. "There you are," Karen said, raising her voice just enough to cut through the lingering noise. "I was about to leave a note, but this is actually good timing." Chloe didn't move. Her body stiffened, the edges of her vision narrowing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Her tools were untouched. Karen had brought her own. On the shelf behind her sat a small toolkit, neatly unzipped, with voltage meters, measuring tape, and a black and white laminated sheet titled Site Survey Checklist. Chloe blinked, then said flatly, "What are you doing in my house?" Karen tilted her head and responded with a perfectly rehearsed tone. "I received a complaint about possible non-compliance regarding noise output and system strain from your electric dryer. It was recommended that I perform an informal inspection before this became a formal issue." She said it as if reading from a manual, like it was the most mundane and logical thing in the world. Chloe took one step forward, not aggressive but firm. "You broke into my house." That got Karen's attention. Her posture stiffened slightly, her smile becoming thinner, more controlled. "No, not at all. Your side door was unlocked. I assumed that meant access wasn't restricted. And I didn't come inside the living area, only to the panel. It's purely a procedural check." Chloe's heart was pounding now, but she kept her voice low and even. "Dear Trespassing, you are not authorized to be in this house. You are not law enforcement. You are not a licensed inspector. Leave." Karen raised her hand slightly, almost mockingly, in a no-harm-done gesture. "There's no need to be defensive. I'm not accusing you of anything. But if this isn't addressed, it can escalate. I thought you'd prefer a quiet resolution." Chloe said nothing more. She walked to the garage wall, reached for the large panel with the keypad, and hit the panic button that automatically dialed local authorities. The loud beeping startled even Karen. "You're calling the police?" she asked, sounding genuinely baffled. "Is that really necessary?" "You entered my home without permission," Chloe said simply. "You're damn right it is." Karen packed up quickly. She didn't run, but she moved with the precision of someone who had practiced this scenario in her head and knew how to exit with minimal friction. She gathered her tools, straightened her visor, and left through the same door she had apparently entered. By the time the officers arrived just under 9 minutes later, Karen was nowhere in sight. Chloe explained everything. The officers, both young and polite but clearly not expecting anything serious, nodded as she recounted the situation. One took basic notes while the other looked over the side door. "There's no visible forced entry," he said, almost apologetically. Chloe pointed out that Karen had admitted walking in uninvited. "Did she damage anything?" "No," Chloe admitted, but she drilled into the wall next to the circuit panel. She had a clipboard with a checklist. She treated it like a legitimate operation. The officer gave a non-committal grunt. "We can take a report, but without damage or threat, it's likely to be treated as a civil matter. If she does it again, though, that's a different story. Let us know." The official response left Chloe unsettled. Technically, the police hadn't done anything wrong. They followed protocol, took her statement, and logged the incident. But the tone had been dismissive, and there was no promise of follow-up. Chloe didn't press. She thanked them, watched their cruiser drive away, and locked every single door in her home. Twice. That night, she sat at her dining table with her laptop and tried to look up local ordinances about home inspections, residential privacy rights, and who exactly had authority in her neighborhood to perform checks or issue complaints. The more she read, the murkier it got. Some rules referenced the city's building code. Others fell under community guidelines from the now-defunct developer who had originally built the neighborhood. There were vague terms like volunteer compliance auditors and non-binding courtesy evaluations, but no specific names, no addresses, no signatures. It was a spiderweb of terminology, enough to make even a seasoned lawyer dizzy. Chloe wasn't a lawyer, but she had enough common sense to see what was happening. Karen had no real authority, but she had familiarity, a rehearsed vocabulary, and confidence, three things that could convince almost anyone that she was acting with purpose. And more importantly, she had access. Chloe couldn't prove how she had entered the property, whether the door had truly been unlocked, or if Karen had some other method, but the fact remained that she had entered, worked, and left with a self-assuredness that only came from repetition. This wasn't her first time doing something like this. And if Chloe didn't draw a hard line now, it wouldn't be the last. The next day, Chloe made copies of her police report, installed a new interior lock on the side door, and added a second camera, this one hidden facing the utility room. She also visited the local municipal office in person, asking to speak with someone about community oversight complaints. The receptionist there was friendly but clearly flustered when Chloe mentioned Karen Miller by name. "Oh," she said, awkwardly. "Karen's very involved. But she's not on any official staff list. She just volunteers a lot." Chloe asked if volunteers were supposed to enter homes for inspections. The receptionist's smile faded a little. "Not exactly. No, but I don't think she would mean harm." Chloe didn't argue. She thanked her and left. The silence in her home was heavier that night. Chloe kept the lights on longer. She checked the locks twice before going to bed. Around 3 a.m., she woke suddenly. No sounds, no light, just a sense, intangible, electric, that something was wrong. She walked quietly through the house, bare feet on cold floor, eyes adjusting to the dark. Everything looked normal, but her skin prickled. She stood in the living room for nearly 10 minutes, listening, watching, waiting. Nothing happened. No intrusion, no flashlights, no movement. But she couldn't shake the feeling. She returned to bed but didn't fall asleep. The following afternoon, she received mail not in her mailbox, but folded neatly into a plastic sleeve and zip-tied to her gate. It was another notice. This one had clearer formatting, with a mocked-up letterhead at the top that read Residential Oversight Notice, Field Review Summary. It was unsigned, undated, and obviously fabricated. The list of infractions included incomplete exterior uniformity, light pollution risk, and unsecured recreational equipment, likely referencing her lawn chairs. At the bottom, in red print, this matter may be escalated if further non-compliance is observed. This wasn't just passive-aggressive neighbor behavior anymore. It was targeted, systemic, and escalating. Chloe realized then that what had seemed like an isolated incident was part of a larger, rehearsed pattern. Karen was building a case, real or imagined, and if Chloe didn't act carefully and deliberately, she'd find herself backed into a corner she hadn't even seen being constructed around her. And now there was no room left for tolerance. The next 2 weeks unfolded with a kind of calculated pressure that Chloe could feel pressing against her from all sides. It didn't come all at once, but in a steady drip, like water from a cracked pipe slowly saturating the floorboards, just slow enough that you start to question whether the wetness is real or imagined. Each day brought something new, and none of it felt random. It started with the mail. 8 packages she'd been waiting on from her supplier in Colorado arrived torn open, taped back together sloppily, with contents that had clearly been examined. A set of rare brass hinges had gone missing entirely, replaced with a generic note from the shipping carrier that simply read, "Contents damaged upon arrival." We apologize for the inconvenience. Chloe called to complain and was met with automated phone trees and long hold music, but nothing ever came of it. Then it was the garbage bins again, this time not knocked over, but dragged into the middle of the street and arranged side by side like some kind of barrier. One had been filled with water, the other had its lid duct taped shut. No one claimed to see who did it. The morning after that, Chloe stepped outside and found her gate open, the padlock missing. It hadn't been broken, it had been carefully removed, as if someone had taken their time, used proper tools, and then walked off with it like it was a borrowed item they never intended to return. She checked the rest of the perimeter, nothing stolen, nothing vandalized. Just the absence of the lock and the subtle message it implied. Someone had been here, and they wanted her to know it. She bought a new lock that same afternoon, a heavier one with a digital keypad. She didn't even bother installing it right away. Instead, she sat in her workshop and stared at the package, trying to decide if she was being prudent or paranoid. Logic told her the two weren't mutually exclusive. By that weekend, the tension had taken a physical toll. Chloe wasn't sleeping. She woke multiple times each night, sometimes to the sound of her wind chimes ringing when there was no wind, sometimes to silence so heavy it made her ears buzz. She started drinking her morning coffee with a shakiness that wasn't from the caffeine. It was around that time she noticed the car. Not always the same one, but always the same kind, mid-sized sedans with tinted windows, idling just down the street. They'd stay for 10, sometimes 15 minutes, parked beneath the old elm that leaned just past the fourth house on the right. The engines were always running. The drivers never got out. And when Chloe tried to casually walk by and get a glimpse through the windshield, the cars would pull away slowly, deliberately, and without urgency. She tried to tell herself that maybe it was a rideshare driver waiting for a fare. Maybe it was a neighbor's guest who preferred the shade. But the way it kept happening, different license plates, same behavior, it became impossible to ignore. She finally spoke to one of her neighbors, a retired nurse named Eileen who lived 2 doors down and often tended to a lush garden of roses and violets near the sidewalk. Eileen was kind, in that carefully measured way older people can be when they're trying not to step on social landmines. Chloe asked her, cautiously, if she'd noticed anything strange, people watching the street, odd notes on doors, or packages arriving tampered with. Eileen looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You're not the first to ask that." She didn't elaborate, but there was a shadow in her voice, a hesitation that Chloe recognized instantly as fear masked by politeness. That silence said more than any answer could. Something was wrong in the neighborhood, and people knew it, but they weren't talking. One afternoon, as Chloe was setting up her table saw in the garage, she noticed movement in the backyard. It wasn't overt, just the flicker of a shadow moving along the back fence. She stepped out, tools still running, and saw Karen standing by the side of the house. She wasn't on Chloe's property. Not exactly. Her feet were positioned just outside the line where the sidewalk curved toward the neighbor's yard, but her eyes were fixed on the upstairs window. When she saw Chloe, she smiled, wide and calm. "Just admiring your roofline," she said. "It's a bit off kilter, don't you think? That can be a hazard in strong winds." Chloe didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence between them was already a conversation, one that ended when Karen turned and walked away without another word. The next day, Chloe's name appeared in an online forum that was supposedly for local homeowners to share advice and updates. The post, made by a user named Fairness First, accused her of violating aesthetic standards, being rude to volunteers, and possibly operating an unlicensed business out of a residential zone. Though the post was vague, the implication was clear. Someone was trying to label her as a problem. Chloe screenshot the post and sent it to her lawyer, just in case. The lawyer, a practical woman named Teresa whom Chloe had worked with on her purchase contract, responded within an hour, "Keep documenting. Don't respond online. These people are testing your reaction." Chloe took her advice. She stopped reading the forum. But she didn't stop watching. She installed 2 new cameras, one facing the back garden, the other overlooking the driveway. Both were cloud-connected, encrypted, and wired to a separate power source in the garage. She knew from experience that battery-powered models were easy to disable. She didn't advertise the camera's presence, but she also didn't try to hide them completely. If Karen or anyone else was paying attention, they'd know they were being watched, and that was the point. What Chloe didn't expect was the escalation that came next. One night, just after 11, she heard a loud clang from the side yard. It wasn't the kind of noise that came from animals or whined. It was heavy, metallic, deliberate. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out the back door, moving slowly along the wall until she reached the gate. The new digital lock was still intact, still lit green, but just beyond it, lying in the dirt, was a steel pry bar. Not hers. It was old, rusted, the kind used in demolition work, too heavy to be casual. She scanned the yard with the flashlight but saw no movement, no one hiding among the bushes or crouched behind the compost bins. It was as if the tool had simply appeared, dropped like a calling card. She took a photo, bagged the bar in a plastic contractor bag, and stored it in her garage. When she checked the camera footage later, she discovered the feed had glitched at 10:59p.m. a clean 5-minute blackout. Both cameras. The cloud log confirmed the interruption, but not the cause. It wasn't a power issue. It was something else. The next morning she found a new note, this time not a notice or printed flyer, but handwritten on yellow-lined paper in a neat cursive style. We all have to do our part. Resistance makes things harder for everyone. Don't isolate yourself. It was taped to the front door, just above the handle. No envelope, no name, just that message. Just vague enough to pass as concern, just threatening enough to hit her in the chest like a fist. That's when Chloe knew she couldn't ride this out by herself. She called her lawyer again and arranged a formal meeting. They sat in Teresa's office with the folder Chloe had assembled: photos, receipts, timelines, printouts, incident logs, and USB drives. Teresa listened closely, her eyes narrowing as she flipped through the material. She didn't interrupt. When Chloe finished, Teresa leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This isn't just neighborly hostility," she said. "This is targeted pressure. If I didn't know better, I'd say they're trying to push you to leave. Force you out without ever saying the words. It's psychological eviction." The phrase struck Chloe hard. She hadn't thought of it that way, but the truth of it was undeniable. The noise, the notes, the subtle invasions, they were all designed to destabilize her. Teresa suggested filing a formal cease and desist letter, addressed not to Karen specifically, but to any individuals engaging in unauthorized surveillance or interference. Chloe agreed. She also asked about the legality of private patrols or volunteer auditors conducting checks without identification. Teresa frowned. Highly questionable. You're within your rights to demand credentials and refuse entry. If they enter again, we press trespassing charges. Hard. Chloe left the office with a copy of the draft letter and a checklist of things to document going forward. That night, as she sat on her porch watching the streetlights flicker, a car rolled past, slowly, windows up, headlights dimmed. She didn't move. She didn't look away. This time she raised her phone and took a photo. The car didn't stop. It didn't speed up either. It just kept moving like a shark circling water it already knew was full of blood. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. But she was done playing nice. The shift came not with a confrontation, but with something deceptively subtle, an envelope that didn't look like the others. It arrived by regular mail, buried among bills and flyers, its surface blank except for her name typed in the center, no return address. No postage mark, no handwriting. Chloe turned it over twice before opening it, a part of her already bracing for another bizarre notice or manufactured violation. But what she found was stranger than she expected. Inside was a single black and white photocopy of a map and old survey of the neighborhood, faded, warped, and marked up with red pen. Her property was outlined in thick ink, but so was an adjoining lot, one that wasn't hers. At the top corner, a handwritten note in the same sharp cursive from the yellow note she'd received earlier: disputed perimeter, documentation pending resolution. Chloe stared at it for a long time, her fingers curling around the edge of the paper, as her thoughts turned in directions she didn't like. There had been no boundary dispute, no complaint filed with the city, no survey ordered by her. And yet here it was, a preemptive claim that something was wrong, a suggestion that her house, her land, her place in this neighborhood was not secure. She contacted Teresa immediately, scanning and sending the map with a terse explanation. Teresa replied within the hour, "This looks like groundwork. We'll set up for a formal challenge. I've seen this tactic before. You need an official survey done now, your own, not theirs." Chloe didn't wait. She called a licensed land surveyor and paid the rush fee. Within 2 days, a pair of workers arrived at her property with tripods, GPS markers, and the polite professionalism of people used to stepping into silent wars between neighbors. The results were unsurprising. Her boundaries were exactly as recorded in her purchase deed. No errors, no encroachments. Nothing that could possibly be used against her, at least not by anyone operating in good faith. She had the documents notarized, copied, and archived in triplicate. She even brought a copy to the municipal zoning office, where the clerk thanked her and promised to update the system, though her voice carried the faint fatigue of someone who'd seen stranger things and expected they would see stranger still. But even with the proof in her hands, Chloe knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't about the truth. It was about perception, and Karen was already working to reshape that perception, one neighbor at a time. It began with a community meeting, an open forum scheduled quarterly but rarely attended by more than a dozen residents. Chloe hadn't planned on going. She hated public confrontation, hated the idea of sitting in a folding chair under fluorescent lights while strangers whispered behind their hands. But when her name appeared on the meeting agenda, listed under resident concerns, non-conforming modifications and potential legal risk, she realized she had no choice. She arrived early, dressed plainly, her hair tied back, a copy of her deed and survey report in a folder under her arm. The room was already half full. Karen stood near the front, chatting with a small group of people who nodded along as she gestured toward the door, the sidewalk, and the map pinned to the wall. Chloe took a seat near the back, her posture straight, her face unreadable. The meeting began with procedural updates, trash schedules, sidewalk repairs, something about a new streetlight installation. Then came the item Chloe had been dreading. Karen took the floor, not as a formal representative, but as a concerned member of the community. She spoke softly, almost sweetly, about the importance of safety, harmony, and collective responsibility. Then she turned toward Chloe without naming her and described a particular property that had made unapproved changes and was potentially in violation of zoning setbacks. She mentioned new construction materials, unauthorized utility work, and complaints about runoff. Her words were couched in disclaimers, always prefaced with perhaps, reportedly, or as I understand it. It was weaponized vagueness, delivered with practiced humility. When Chloe stood to respond, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply opened her folder and distributed copies of the official survey, stamped and signed. She explained that no construction had been performed beyond what was legally permitted, that her property lines were not in dispute, and that no formal complaints had been filed against her. She looked directly at Karen as she spoke, but Karen didn't flinch. She smiled politely, then nodded as if the matter had been clarified. But as Chloe sat down, she saw it in the corner of her eye, Karen leaning toward the man beside her, whispering something, and the subtle shake of his head as he glanced back toward Chloe. After the meeting, several neighbors approached her not to accuse, but to offer half-hearted reassurance. It's probably just a misunderstanding. Karen can be a little intense sometimes. You know how things get around here. Chloe smiled, thanked them, and went home. But as she stepped into her yard and locked the gate behind her, she felt it the shift. The silence wasn't the same anymore. It felt heavier, suspicious, expectant. And she knew then that she was no longer just a person who lived quietly on the corner lot. She was now a subject of discussion, a topic, a file in someone's mental cabinet of problematic variables. That night, she reviewed the security footage again. This time, she wasn't looking for intruders. She was studying behavior. Karen's pacing patterns, the timing of the cars, the rhythms of the watchers. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. She started logging movements, building a timeline. Not for confrontation, but for survival. This wasn't going to resolve itself. It was deepening. And Chloe knew something else now, something more disturbing than any broken fence or missing padlock. Karen wasn't trying to win. She was trying to wear her down, inch by inch, until the pressure became unbearable, and she gave up voluntarily. It was a siege, not a battle. But Chloe didn't break. She called Teresa again and requested a written warning letter to be sent, this time directly to Karen. It was firm but not aggressive, legally sound, and documented. Teresa added a clause about potential defamation if Karen continued to circulate false claims. Chloe also contacted a licensed home inspector, not because she needed one, but because she wanted an official third-party report on file that stated her home met all required codes. She wanted paperwork, witnesses, facts. She wanted a wall of evidence too solid to be denied. What she didn't expect was for the response to come not as a letter, but as a sign. Literally. She came home one afternoon to find a laminated sheet staked into her lawn, about the size of a parking notice. It read, under neighborhood observation, pending review of nonconformance. No organization, no contact info, just those words in block letters, standing like an accusation. She took it down. The next day, another appeared, this time taped to her mailbox. She removed that too. The message was clear, and it had nothing to do with rules or property lines. It was about control, and Karen was making it known that the rules didn't matter not when she was the one defining them. That night, Chloe stood in the backyard, arms crossed, watching the shadows stretch across the fence as the sun went down. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, rattling the edge of the tarp she'd hung over her lumber pile. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from the driveway camera. Motion detected. She didn't check it immediately. She already knew what it would show. The same car, the same engine idling, the same silent watcher behind the glass. But this time she didn't just note the time. She stepped inside, picked up her phone, and made a new entry in her log. She didn't know when this would end, but she was certain of one thing: she wouldn't be the one to blink first. It was shortly after the lawn sign incident that things began to sharpen, not in tone, but in precision. The passive aggression that once felt like background noise suddenly aligned into a focused campaign, and Chloe knew the line had been crossed. The signs were no longer just signs. They were messages carved with surgical control, left in increasingly intrusive places: her front door handle, her car's windshield, and once, tucked beneath the mat inside her screened-in back porch, which meant someone had come past 2 locked gates without leaving a trace. She tried not to show it, not to let the adrenaline dictate her pace, but her instincts had long since kicked into gear. Chloe wasn't panicking. She was preparing. What disturbed her most wasn't the escalation of activity, but how calculated the threats had become. This wasn't someone acting in blind anger. It was someone testing limits, one deliberate inch at a time. Then came the code violation letter. Unlike the past fakes, this one was real, stamped, signed, and routed through the municipal office. It claimed she had made unauthorized structural alterations to the exterior of her home and listed potential fines for noncompliance. Chloe knew the allegation was false. Her only recent modification had been repainting a portion of her back deck, which didn't require a permit. But someone had submitted a formal complaint against her property, complete with photos, and the city was obligated to respond. When Chloe called to request a copy of the complaint, She was told it was submitted anonymously, but she already knew who had done it. Karen. Not directly, perhaps. Not by name, but the signature was there in the tone of the accusation, in the obsessive detail, the self-righteous phrasing, and the thinly veiled threat about endangering community cohesion. Chloe forwarded the letter to Teresa, who contacted the inspector assigned to the case. It took 2 days, but eventually they secured a meeting to review the alleged violations. Chloe spent the morning before the inspection photographing every inch of her property, compiling a physical walkthrough record. She wasn't nervous, she was angry. The inspector, a middle-aged man named Donnelly, was cordial and efficient. He walked the perimeter, asked questions, and made notes on a digital tablet. After the inspection, he confirmed there were no violations and that the complaint had been overstated, but he warned that if additional complaints were filed, the city would be required to follow up again. Chloe thanked him and asked carefully if it was common for complaints to be weaponized this way. Donnelly hesitated, then nodded once and said, "You'd be surprised what people will do when they think they're protecting their neighborhood." But Chloe wasn't just being targeted bureaucratically. The emotional pressure was now compounded by a more invasive form of intimidation: her work. One morning she arrived at her garage to find the door partially open. She never left it that way. Inside, nothing appeared stolen, but her workbench had been disturbed, tools shifted, drawers slightly ajar, and her most recent project, a refinished sideboard, had a fresh scratch gouged across its surface. It wasn't accidental. It had been done with intention, just deep enough to ruin the finish but not enough to destroy it. A warning, not an act of destruction. Chloe stood over the piece in silence for several minutes, her breath slow, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She locked the garage, went back inside, and wrote a report for her attorney. Then she installed 2 new interior motion sensors with silent alerts. That night, her phone buzzed at 3:11 a.m. She checked the notification, motion detected in the garage. She tapped the camera feed, expecting maybe a raccoon or a stray cat, but what she saw stopped her cold. A figure short, bundled in dark clothing, standing at the far end of the workbench, moving slowly, deliberately. The image was grainy, the infrared making everything ghostly pale, but she could see them examining something, lifting it, turning it in their hands. Then, suddenly the feed cut out. Not froze, cut. She sat frozen for a moment, phone in hand, listening to the silence beyond the walls of her home. Then she called the police. They arrived quickly, too quickly to be casual. Someone had flagged her address before. 2 officers swept the property while Chloe stayed inside, waiting. When they returned, they reported no signs of forced entry and no one found on the premises. Chloe showed them the footage, but they said without a clearer image or evidence of damage, they couldn't pursue trespassing charges. She asked if they'd at least file an incident report. They agreed. Before leaving, one officer said quietly, it might help to install better lighting. Cameras are good, but some people aren't afraid of being seen. Chloe understood the implication. Whoever this was didn't fear exposure because they believed there'd be no consequences. And so far they'd been right. 2 days later, Chloe received a certified letter from a local law office. Karen was threatening a civil suit not for defamation or trespassing, but for negligent environmental impact. According to the letter, Chloe's yard contributed to water pooling on adjacent properties, allegedly resulting in soil degradation and loss of plant life. It was ludicrous. Her property had a regulated drainage system, and the landscape was untouched beyond simple maintenance. But the complaint was cleverly worded. It cited obscure residential ordinances, attached poorly taken photographs of water stains on someone else's retaining wall, and included the assertion that Chloe's inaction had negatively impacted community harmony. Teresa reviewed the letter and responded swiftly with a formal denial and counter notice, warning of malicious litigation. But Chloe knew what this really was, another front in the war. They weren't trying to win in court. They were trying to overwhelm her, to exhaust her resolve with bureaucracy, to make the process so unbearable she would walk away from the fight. But she didn't walk. She pushed back. She filed a restraining order not against Karen directly, but against unnamed individuals engaging in surveillance, trespassing, or harassment on or near the property of Ms. Chloe Barton. It was a strategic move. Naming no one gave her room to apply it broadly. A judge approved a temporary order pending a hearing, and that gave her just enough leverage to send formal warnings to anyone associated with Karen's group of community volunteers. At the same time, she began collecting statements anonymous, quiet, hesitant from neighbors who had seen similar behavior. One woman admitted Karen had entered her yard under the guise of checking soil quality. A man down the block confessed Karen had once accused him of having aggressive shrubbery and hinted she could escalate the matter if he didn't cooperate with landscaping guidelines. Chloe's case was no longer theoretical. She was building a pattern. Then, one night, the silence broke in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was in her kitchen, making tea, when the power went out. Not just a flicker, total blackness. She waited for the hum of backup systems to kick in, but nothing happened. She moved quickly, grabbing her flashlight and checking the breaker panel. Everything looked normal. She stepped outside to investigate, and that's when she saw it. The power box behind her house was open, the main switch physically severed, not flipped cut. As she stood there stunned, the beam of her flashlight caught something else scattered on the ground beneath the panel were zip ties, an empty nitrile glove wrapper, and a folded note, weighted down by a rock. She picked it up with shaking fingers. It read, "Simply, you're making this harder than it needs to be." This time Chloe didn't call the police first. She called Teresa. Then she called a local journalist she'd met years ago at a woodworking expo who had since moved into reporting on community issues and government overreach. She wasn't looking for publicity. She was looking for daylight, for exposure. Karen and her people operated in shadows, in ambiguity, in the space between what could be proved and what could be denied. Chloe was going to drag them out into the open, even if she had to burn their narrative to the ground in the process. The next day, the journalist visited, camera in hand, not for a broadcast, but to document. Chloe didn't pose or dramatize. She showed him everything: the notes, the footage, the complaints, the survey, the severed power line. He didn't promise to publish. He promised to look. That was enough. And as he drove away, Chloe stood on her porch with the wind tugging at her sleeves, watching the shadows move between the trees and the curb. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was watching back. The tipping point came not with confrontation, not with a final act of aggression or some melodramatic confession, but with something altogether quieter, colder, and more violating than Chloe had imagined possible. It happened just after midnight on a Wednesday, the kind of night where the air felt too still, too heavy, as if the entire neighborhood were holding its breath. Chloe had fallen asleep on the couch, the faint sound of a documentary playing in the background, when she woke suddenly, not to a noise, but to the sense of being watched. Her heart pounded before she even opened her eyes. She sat up in silence, ears straining, eyes scanning the darkened room. And that's when she saw it, the shadow of movement just outside the front window. Not a car. Not an animal. A figure. A human. Still. Close. She reached for her phone and pulled up the live feed from her porch camera. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, Karen, unmistakably standing inches from the camera, face angled upward, wearing a utility vest and holding a clipboard. Her expression was not the fake politeness Chloe had grown used to, but something blank, almost clinical. And beside her stood another person, a man Chloe didn't recognize, dressed in dark coveralls, holding what appeared to be a tool case. The two of them were speaking, their mouths moving, but the audio was muted. Chloe watched, frozen, as the man knelt by her mailbox and began removing something from the base panel. Karen glanced once at the camera, then deliberately stepped forward and blocked the lens with a sheet of paper, white, blank, covering everything. That's when Chloe moved. She didn't shout. She didn't call out into the night. She grabbed her phone, hit the emergency button, and called 911. As the dispatcher confirmed her location and asked for details, Chloe moved through the house quickly, checking locks, flipping switches, and arming her full alarm system. The dispatcher told her officers were already en route. Chloe didn't wait. She stepped into her backyard with her flashlight and a heavy wrench from the garage. She wasn't planning to use it, but she also wasn't planning to stand behind a door and wait. As she reached the rear gate, she saw motion in the alley behind her property, two silhouettes disappearing into the darkness, one of them glancing back before ducking behind a hedge. She didn't pursue. She stood there, breathing hard, as the distant sound of sirens cut through the night air. The police arrived in under 5 minutes. Chloe met them at the front of the house, showed them the footage, and led them to the mailbox. What they found wasn't just tampering, it was installation. Someone had placed a small, unauthorized wireless device inside the panel. The officer didn't know what it was exactly, but it had an antenna, a tiny battery pack, and was secured with a new set of screws that didn't match the original hardware. It wasn't vandalism. It was surveillance. The device was confiscated, the area photographed, and Chloe was asked to provide any previous documentation related to neighborhood conflicts. This time she had everything. The notes, the signs, the photos, the legal letters, the severed power line, the scratch on her furniture, and now the physical evidence they couldn't ignore. What followed was a whirlwind of reports, statements, and rapid movement. Teresa called in a specialist to examine the device and confirmed it was a signal interceptor meant to monitor or potentially disrupt wireless communication. It wasn't just invasive, it was illegal. A formal criminal complaint was filed, and while the police didn't name Karen directly, they knew where to look. Chloe was advised to remain home for questioning and to avoid contact with any of the involved parties. The officers took her security footage and said it would be reviewed by detectives. For the first time in months, Chloe felt something new creeping up through the exhaustion validation. It was finally on record. It was no longer her word against suggestion. It was action. Documented. Real. But that didn't mean the retaliation stopped. Within 24 hours, Chloe's face appeared in a neighborhood newsletter, an unofficial one, passed door to door in printed form. The paper included a blurry photo of her taken from across the street and a block of text describing her as a danger to community harmony, someone who refused engagement, filed false complaints, and acted aggressively toward neighbors attempting to maintain order. It was unsigned, of course, but Chloe recognized the language. She kept the copy, logged it, and sent it to Teresa. The lawyer responded within minutes. This qualifies as targeted defamation. We act now. Teresa filed an emergency motion for a protective order and contacted the press directly, not to leak Chloe's story, but to ensure that the community narrative wouldn't be dominated by rumor. The local journalist who had visited earlier published a piece not sensational but precise. It outlined how unchecked volunteer enforcement, especially by individuals with no legal authority, could lead to harassment, mental distress, and, in Chloe's case, criminal acts. Names weren't published, but the damage was done. The article was shared, discussed, and printed copies appeared on neighborhood bulletin boards the following morning. The illusion of Karen's control, carefully built over years of whispers and fear, began to crack. And then came the subpoena. Karen, now identified as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation into unauthorized surveillance and criminal trespass, was ordered to appear in court. She didn't take it quietly. Her attorney filed a motion to dismiss, citing community-based concern, but the judge rejected it. Chloe was present for the hearing. She sat in the gallery while her lawyer submitted exhibits, photos, videos, timelines, and watched as Karen, for the first time, showed signs of unraveling. Her tone was sharp, her hands restless, her once perfectly measured voice now edged with irritation. When asked directly whether she had entered Chloe's property without permission, she hesitated, looked toward her attorney, and answered, "I don't recall." The courtroom paused. That moment, 3 words spoke louder than everything she had said before. The judge did not issue a final ruling that day, but he approved the extension of the protective order and scheduled a hearing for formal charges to proceed. Outside the courtroom, Chloe didn't speak to reporters or other residents. She went home, quietly, and for the first time in a long while her house felt like a sanctuary again, even if only for a night. But it wasn't over. 2 nights later, Chloe received a call, unknown number, no voicemail. She ignored it. Then another. Then a text, "You think this ends with court?" No name. No reply. She didn't panic. She called the detective handling her case and forwarded everything. They traced the number to a burner phone, untraceable, unregistered. Chloe installed 2 more cameras, updated her alarm system, and activated private monitoring with a direct line to law enforcement. She wasn't scared. She was prepared. Karen's power was crumbling, but people like her didn't surrender, they doubled down. And Chloe knew, deep down, that a final act was coming. When it did, she wasn't caught off guard. It came in the form of a last-minute complaint, an anonymous tip submitted to city officials, alleging that Chloe was illegally operating a hazardous materials site in her garage. It was absurd, but it triggered a mandatory inspection. Chloe was notified 2 hours in advance, and when the city officials arrived, clipboard in hand, she greeted them with her documents already printed, every permit and license neatly arranged in a folder. They inspected. They found nothing. They left, professionally polite, and Chloe stood in the driveway as they drove off, eyes scanning the street. There was no car parked in the shadows this time. No figure watching from a distance. No movement behind the hedges. Just wind, just silence, and Chloe finally standing on solid ground. This time, the victory didn't feel like relief. It felt like reclamation. The following week unfolded with the quietness of a storm that had finally broken and passed. No new signs appeared, no late-night motion alerts, no mysterious cars idling at the edge of the street. Chloe moved through her house with cautious steps at first, still anticipating something, a last gasp, a final act of resistance, but none came. The silence now wasn't heavy. It was still, real. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of tension. It was only when she realized she'd slept through the night, no interruptions, no false alarms, that she allowed herself to believe it might be over. Not paused. Not dormant. Over. Karen's legal status was made official within days. The court issued a ruling barring her from holding any administrative or enforcement role in neighborhood affairs for a period of 5 years. The protective order was made permanent. The judge, in his final remarks, noted that the pattern of behavior extended far beyond neighborly concern and constituted a deliberate and sustained effort to undermine the legal autonomy and mental well-being of another resident. Karen was fined, stripped of her so-called volunteer credentials, and formally admonished by the city for abuse of public reporting channels. Her attorney made no statement. Karen herself didn't attend the final hearing, citing medical stress, which the court acknowledged but did not honor as grounds for dismissal. Chloe didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She listened, she watched, and when the final paperwork was handed to her, she simply nodded and left the courtroom without a word. The neighborhood shifted subtly after that. People who once looked away when she passed began making eye contact again. A few offered short greetings, nothing forced, nothing warm, just acknowledgments. A man from 3 houses down returned a hand tool she hadn't realized she'd lent out during her move in weeks. Eileen, the rose gardener, left a note tucked beneath a small potted violet that simply read, "I'm glad you stayed." Chloe didn't respond directly, but she replanted the violet in a prominent spot near the walkway, and when Eileen walked by the next morning, their eyes met briefly through the fence slats. That was enough. Karen put her house up for sale 3 weeks later. The listing appeared quietly, with no open house, No visible sign, just a discreet digital posting that was taken down just as quickly once the sale closed. No one knew who bought it, but a young couple moved in soon after, and they didn't mention Karen's name once. They kept to themselves, waved when waved at, and planted daffodils along the sidewalk. Chloe didn't go out of her way to befriend them, but she nodded once when they passed, and they nodded back. That was the new normal, and it was enough. The damage Karen left behind wasn't visible, not in the traditional sense. There were no broken windows, no burned grass, no physical scars. But Chloe could still feel the way her body instinctively stiffened at unexpected knocks or flickering lights. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant rebuilding without apology, and she had already started. She restored the sideboard that had been scratched during the garage intrusion, sanded it down, sealed it with resin, and delivered it quietly, without invoice to the local library, where she'd once spent afternoons sketching architectural trim for her work. It was placed near the entrance to the children's reading room, unnoticed by most but deeply symbolic to her. As the weeks passed, Chloe resumed her routines. She opened the windows more often. She worked late into the night without fear. She stopped checking the cameras every hour, but she didn't disable them. Some measures were not about fear, they were about agency. She'd learned, in the worst way, that silence could be a mask for aggression and civility a cloak for control. But she'd also learned something else. When properly armed with truth, precision, and persistence, even the most isolated individual could hold their ground. One afternoon, Teresa called with an update. A civil case had been filed, one Chloe hadn't initiated, but which involved a different neighbor now bringing charges against Karen's estate for similar harassment dating back over a year. Chloe listened as Teresa explained the parallels, the timing, and the evidence that had surfaced after Chloe's case became public. "You broke the seal," Teresa said. "You weren't just the first to fight back. You were the one who showed it could be done." Chloe didn't know what to say to that. She hadn't been trying to be an example. She just wanted her life back. But now, hearing that someone else might find relief because of what she endured there was something satisfying in that. Not vindication. Not revenge. Just balance. A restoration of order. By summer, the garden had bloomed fully, and Chloe began making furniture again, not out of tension but out of creative hunger. Her focus had returned, her mind no longer fractured by fear or hypervigilance. The emails from her clients no longer piled up unanswered. Her hands, once stiff with stress, had regained their calm precision. One night, as cicadas buzzed in the distance and the sky stretched violet and gold, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and no phone in her hand. No noise, no notes on her door, no watchers. Just the sound of wind in the leaves and the scent of new varnish from the table beside her. A year ago, this house had felt like a battleground. Now it felt like what it had always been, meant to be a home. And when she finally turned off the porch light and stepped back inside, locking the door behind her with a soft click, Chloe Barton did not check the cameras, did not look over her shoulder, did not scan the shadows. She simply moved through her space with quiet purpose and slept deep, dreamless and undisturbed.